And here we are recording the wonderful Mahulili Leilani, and I understand a dear friend, namely Stuart Pearce. Together. I know I consider you to be a dear friend. And this is a third recorded conversation that we've made over the last few months about issues that deeply interest us, deeply concern us, and that have percolated through our systems, and we've joined in a coherence talking about. And today, we decided that we would call today the dialogue of silence, or indeed the dialogue within silence, as the completion of three major dialogues that we've had. The first being mystical relationships, the second being the cosmology of feeling, and now here we are, the dialogue in silence.
And I think where we started what we went to when we first said hello before you pressed record is a very good place to begin. We were talking about you and asking me how I was doing, said, well, things are sure turbulent out there, very bumpy. And as I've seen it with friends and clients and even in myself, that turbulence is challenging, and it kind of rises up to challenge what is actually real. Not to say that turbulence itself in these times isn't real and isn't physical and isn't to be really considered, but that deeper thing in us that is real, some people know about for certainty and easily bring themselves to that, or more easily bring themselves to that place. But others believe it to be there and real. And others hope that it's there and real. And still others, having heard of it, want so much to believe that it's real. That center place, that place where there's a greater peace and ease in balancing ourselves. And yet, only for those who know it of certainty, who have truly integrated that beyond a belief system, have the greater ease of it. And so what I've seen with people is it's a challenging time to keep their hope in it alive, to keep their hope and their beliefs that spiritual things are true is alive. And that place that we're talking about is often accessed by the silence. And we often think of it as the same thing. So that's why I thought it might be a good place for us to begin the conversation about coming into the silence.
Yes, and of course we're recording this as we finish September 2020. And what I'm reminded of as I embrace all that you've just said is that this has been a year of extraordinary processes. And the nature of the unrest that we're talking about in people's hearts, in people's bodies, in people's minds, and also in the external reality of our lives, in the urban situations where much unrest is tearing us apart. That really the whole of this year has been dedicated to one major theme and a lot of extrapolating themes. And that major theme is survival. Mm. And it feels to me that, apropos the points that you've just made, that the theme of survival is really percolating through the substance of, well, how, what do you survive for? Are you really living the quintessence of what you are all about, that we are children of God? How close are we to God? And how much have we forgotten God? So the levels of survival are really these aspects of tearing us apart until we define that we need to move from survival into thriving.
Mm-hmm.
The only way that we can truly thrive is by remembering what our relationship with the divine is, that we are a spark of the divine, we are children of the divine, and not just through some ideological manifestation, some philosophy or fundamental credo, but are we really holding love in our hearts and therefore celebrating love for each and every one of us, whatever our opinions, whatever our diversity? How can we accept each other, whether we're, black or white, gay or straight, pretty or dull, um, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, male, female, all of the great diversity of what God's kingdom is all about. How we can move truly into thriving and understand that the only route to that constant appraisal of self in relation to the divine is through the dialogue in silence, because God lives in the silence, I believe. Not in the action. We bring the divine into the action because I would love to think, to feel that each of our creations, whatever they may be, whether it's our conversations, our dialogue through this process, or that we then go and create in the world, whether it's a beautiful meal or baking a wonderful cake or sculpting a beautiful statue or writing an amazing book or composing an extraordinary symphony or producing, presumably in your context, producing an amazing retreat or healing workshop where we come together and experience true communion. That if we can actually move into emanation, the beauty is an emanation of the divine, and that if we can sign everything with an autograph of excellence, I believe that we are living, not in some neurotic way, but we're living in a very profound spiritual, the fervor of our spirituality, we're living it very close to God's conversation about what he would like us, or what he, she, it would like us to be.
Mm-hmm.
I am reminded of an extraordinary passage that I found many, many years ago, written, it's brief, but which I'd love to share with you, if I may.
Do, yeah.
I feel it's very pertinent to what we're talking about. And it was written by Paramahansa Yogananda, the great yogi, who of course who originated in India and was given direction about his spiritual lineage, that he was to bring Kriya Yoga to the world, to the Western world. And this would have been in 1918, 1919, and he arrived in the 20s in the United States of America and had a huge following of the intelligentsia of the US, huge following. So, for example, he would provide a dissertation in a major theater in one of the major cities throughout the US, and hundreds of people would attend. This very unusual looking man with very long brown hair, wearing dresses that were always highly colored, and probably lots and lots and lots of beads, in the way that Hindu
flowers.
Flowers, yes, flowers in his hair as well. And he taught, and he was a number of people who were some of the major political components at that time, such as the Roosevelts, for example, attended and were ravished by his teachings and by his beauty, his grace, and of course his great love. So he wrote this: I wandered through forests of incessant searching and arrived at the mystery door of thy presence in paradise. And on the doors of silence, I knocked loudly with my heavy blows of faith, and the doors of space flew open. And there on the altar of glorious visions, I saw thee resting. I stood with restless eyes, waiting for thee to speak, and heard not thy creation-making voice. But at last, the spell of stillness stole upon me, and in whispers, you taught me the language of angels. With the joyous voice of newborn freedom, I tried to speak, and the light of your temple assumed a sudden brilliance as you wrote in letters of light. In my little chamber of quietness, I am always resting. I never speak, but with the voice of silence. And so through silence, eloquently talk with me using the language of light and love, my child.
Mm. Mm.
And it's wonderful, isn't it? Because it's so gently lyrical and beautiful.
Beautiful.
very sweet and gracious. But
Mm-hmm.
see, there are major teachings held within it about the restless search that we have to find God, the heavy blows of faith, the restless eyes, the doing. And actually, all that God is saying is, can you just calm down? Just be who you are. And when you be, something magical will happen. It reminds me of when I first met Sai Baba, which is nearly 50 years ago. And he said to me, dinking, too much dinking. What's the point of worrying when you can pray? And it was, one of my great teachings right at the very beginning, that I was born, bless them, I was born of warriors, because my parents had fought in the Second War, and I was born just after the Second War. So, of course, they were still traumatized by the war in Europe, the Second World War, and worried, because they were constantly thinking of safety and security. Just as today, we're thinking, well, what are we going to do? This global pause that was created because of the contagion of COVID-19 and the ensuing economic uncertainty. And now, to add to it, we have quaking geopolitical land masses because of what's taking place in the world. So the more stillness we find, the easier it's going to be.
It's a fair question to ask what stillness could mean in the midst of all of this, so much turbulence and unrest, so many questions, so many fears that beset people. And I remember I saw the Dalai Lama give an address. I saw the video of the Dalai Lama's address, in which he said, people, if all the monks in all of the seminaries, etc., were suddenly required to be out living in the world and paying rent and having jobs and things like that, they would struggle just like you do. And so we created in part, the usefulness of the religious institution was to create places where it was easier to live removed and therefore in silence. But I certainly didn't come for that religious type of life this time, nor did I come to live in a more indigenous culture that is also not as embedded in the Western ways of living in the world, or the East. By Western, I mean the, extremely modernized and civilized ways, whether it's East or West, of living in the world. And so what can silence mean in lives such as we have? When I was in the Amazon, yes, it was the Amazon in Ecuador, with a group of Ashwar Indians who had lived the way that they're living for 3,000 years and had allowed very little contact with people such as myself. And our guide was one of the elders involved in leading the group when they decided to begin to have more contact. And it was because they began in their dreaming to see this other world that existed that they didn't know about, that is our world, that was unbelievable to them. And one of the things they decided to do as they began to see how near it was and to feel it right in their rainforest and the destruction that was unimaginably occurring was they decided they needed to come out more and speak to that world. And one of the ways that they were going to do that, you have to fly out of this area. There's no roads. It's very far removed from any road, deep in the Amazon rainforest. And so they decided to become pilots and to start their own air service so that they didn't have to do the only other thing that was possible, hire the oil company airplanes to charter them in and out. And so he was one of the men, the first one sent out to become a pilot in the nearest city, which was 2 hours by small plane, and was what we would call a town, not a city at all. And so he lived there learning to fly and then to teach the other Ashwar men, as it was for them, to become pilots until they had an air service of their own. And so he was there, I believe, 4 years living in this town. And he said they were the very hardest years of his life. We had gone to that town to be picked up by their airplanes and taken out to where we were now visiting with them. And we knew that was just, if even a town, it was a very small place. And he said it was very hard to live in the city. And one of our groups said, well, that's not even the city. And he said, oh, yes, but it was very hard. And we had experienced that small town as a very sudden, rapid change of pace, of course. And so someone in our group challenged him on that and said, well, you know, it's not that hard. And he said it was very hard. And they said, well, were you alone? He said, well, my family, was with me and my children, but otherwise we were alone. Didn't you know anyone else? Well, yes, we gained neighbors, but it was very hard. It was very hard. And as we tried to understand what was so hard, he finally realizing that we didn't perceive it as hard at all, and we're having difficulty understanding that, explained it a little differently. And he said, it's very hard to remember who you are. And one of the women in our group said, but we lived like that all the time. And it's not that hard. You become used to it. And he said, you don't know who you are. You have forgotten. Only people who have forgotten who they are could be destroying the earth. And these are times that cause us to look at how we live. You know, in his view, he invited us then to, really just to be with them there and to see how they lived and to be with how they lived. And I have to say their quality of life was much higher than ours. Their quality of stillness, of silence, their ability just to be in it, their quality of nature, their quality of their relationships, the beauty of the faces of their children and every single tribe member, the ease with which everything from discipline, group discipline, to interpreting dreams was so easy that I did leave with a feeling with a deep understanding about how difficult it is, how we live. And we can't go everyone to live like that in the rainforest. It's probably not going to happen and probably isn't the answer. And we talk about silence, needing more silence, by which we usually mean slowing down and simplifying our lives, which are part of it. And yet what they knew was what is real because they lived in it. Nature, nature is our nature. And they knew their nature, living as they did within nature and not disconnected, and living within their tribe and knowing the place of their tribe in the surrounding that they were in. And these are the things that sort of this knowing what is real then is all part of silence. It's not just sit down and do a 5-minute meditation, but knowing what you're really part of, what you're really connected to.
These are deep thoughts.
And how to live that, how we live.
So the dynamics that I'm trying to fully understand, and I believe that I know them in myself, having, like you, having been into the awareness of what it is to live with indigenous peoples. You know, many years ago, I spent 3 months living with the Bedouin in
Mm-hmm.
the desert. And this was not four-wheel drives. This was camels and sheep or goat, mixture of sheep and goats, mostly goats. And there were 16 of us all living together. And they taught me their ways. So, of course, I dressed as an Arab, and although I didn't speak Arabic well, I did have my own camel and became a really good camel rider. And my camel and I had a great relationship. He was so extraordinary. His name was Babu. Babu. He was absolutely amazing, and you know, didn't just provide me with the ride, but would provide me with warmth and lots of other extraordinary, nourishing things in the middle of the night when it's so freezing cold in the desert and there is nowhere for you to go. And, you know, and the whole business of how do you bathe in the desert and where do you go to the bathroom in the desert? I mean, so in other words, it seems that what we're looking at is the fact that we don't know who we are because we've ceased having truly quintessential relationships with that is most natural, and that therefore that is the orchestration of the divine, the symphony of the divine. So, and for the peoples that you're talking about, having the relationship that they have with the forest, with the trees. You know, I'm reminded, for example, of meeting a certain tribe from the Amazonian who specialize in the drinking of ayahuasca, and how the shaman hears the note, the symphony, the sound of every single plant in the forest.
Mm.
And if you say to somebody who is Caucasian living in the Northern Hemisphere, can you hear the song of that tree? They look at you as though you're mad.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems that what we need to do is to try and find ways of dropping deeper into who we significantly are, because all of this information is deeply within us, in the sense that the whole fiber of our body, whether it be cellular, muscular, or sinewy, or our flesh, is actually primed by the substance of Mother Nature. And that if we only could allow our sensitivity to be rifled with by Mother Nature, by being with her, that we begin to see who we truly are in response to that relationship. We begin to feel that literally nature is within us just as we are within nature. And therefore we could reconfigure who we are. But certainly the doing frenzy that we've caught ourselves in, it has moved us into a level of impossibility. I mean, that's what I found so ravishing about Global Pause this year, that I was in a deep state of bliss for 3.5 months, in the silence, in the stillness. And it wasn't that there was nothing going on. There was a tremendous amount going on. But of course, it wasn't through the doing. It was through the being. And that's when the nature of our conversation came around, of course, because we were led to one another and initially had a deep dialogue, and the deep dialogues were created out of that space of absolute internal listening.
Yes. And recognizing that connection in one another.
Yes. Yeah.
When we talk about being, which we have very much associated with silence, with what we mean when we're talking about a more comprehensive silence than just no spoken word. But when we talk about being, of course, we always come immediately up to that conundrum, is like, how do you be? You know, like, what's the doing of being? And does just being mean sitting around doing nothing? You know, does it mean making no effort toward anything? What does being really mean? We're immediately into it as a great puzzle, a riddle. You know, what does being? So we say that excitedly, and we believe very much we must be more and do less. But then we falter when it comes to actually doing that, or being that, so how does one be that more? I think that also is a fair question. Like, so what is the doing of being? What are the steps? Or what is the switch of thinking?
And it's a question that has really been asked of me, or has been asked, I have asked for many, many, many years, because it is at the very core of the craft that I chose very early in my life, simply because I couldn't do anything else, according to the world. But at the same time, because whenever I took part in high school drama, I was celebrated by statements such as, you're an actor. There's something about your voice. There's something about your voice. And I saw that the person who spoke it, who was often a guide in the form of a teacher, that their aura expanded. Whereas most of the time I was receiving disapprobation, where I saw a completely different color within the aura of the person. And that there was somehow a quality of disparagement, diminishment, and vengefulness in what they were saying. And of course, what I was seeing is their frustration or their fear. So the point that I'm making is that at the core of great acting, acting means action, means doing. But the last thing that the actor must do is to do. He or she needs to be. So, for example, to give an example, a great actor, a very, very great actor, came to me many years ago and said, I've got this screenplay and, I've got the job. So I said, oh, well done. That's fantastic. What is it? Well, I have to play a serial madman. So I said, oh, right. So he said, well, how do I do that? And I said, well, you're the actor, not me. And this was by the time I'd sort of finished 10 years of acting and I'd become a voice coach. And so I said, well, why don't you use the screenplay and try a bit and let's see what happens within you as a vessel of being as you do this. And so he did a bit and he became antic mad. So I said, well, there's one option. That's doing. There's one option. But I have an insight for you. When was the last time that you looked into the eyes of a mad person? Because we've all met mad people. I mean, and what I'm talking about, are severely crazed people. Rather like that moment in Capernaum, I believe it was, when the whole of the village is freaking out over the madman who is being unusual in his behaviors. And they run to Jesus the Master and say, Master, there's a madman. Can you please calm him because he's threatening us? And Jesus said, okay, well, I'll have a go. And he went up to the man and said, who are you? And nobody else had actually thought of asking this. Who are you? And of course, the man said, my name is Legion, for we are many. And in that moment, the master had the ability to manage the crazedness of the man. Obviously, the man was schizophrenic and had so many different personalities that he was behaving in unusual ways, which frightened everybody. However, so going back to my story, my original story, and so the person did the madness, and it seemed to me to be inauthentic and mawkish, but was a possibility. And then I asked, so when was the last time you looked into the face of a mad person? And they immediately welled up and said, not for many years, but I know it very well. So I knew that I touched a chord deep within. So I said, what are you seeing? My father was a raging alcoholic. And his raging alcoholism, whenever he moved into that antic of what the rage was all about, something happened in his eyes that were terrifying. So I said, okay, why don't you do it just like that? And he did. And of course, what there was is this utter stillness.
Mm-hmm.
And that then became a legendary series of movies all about Hannibal Lecter. The stillness.
Mm-hmm. So I would say part of, in what you've said, is part of being is inhabiting. Because what you essentially brought the actor to was to inhabit what his father had inhabited. No, to inhabit where his father had lived, what his father's being was filled with. And so being is to inhabit, and to be in silence is to inhabit silence, not to stop talking. Because we associate silence with lack of audible sound. But I think silence is a fullness of richness of inaudible sounds. The inaudible sounds that are the attributes of the soul, let's say.
Yes.
Attributes of the soul being beauty and harmony. And these things are innate in us, as you mentioned just a little earlier in this conversation. They're in us. And to bring ourselves to inhabit them, there's a fairly simple doing that can help us in that. And that is, we're just remembering. Remembering, I am these things. I am this. And in that pause, inhabit it, reach for it, just like that wonderful story you just told about the actor would reach to inhabit what his father had inhabited. And of course, in him doing that, he would come to know his father in a very visceral way, what it is to inhabit that place. He could only grow in compassion as well for how it is to inhabit that and to live in it.
Thereby hangs a huge story about the nature of that particular craft, which is that it is cathartic.
Yes.
That we go to the theatre to weep out our pain. We go to the theatre to laugh out our pain. And it's interesting that certain theatrical devices are created around societal trauma. And it'll be very interesting, for example, when we get through this period that we're going through, which is obviously severely traumatic for many people all over the world, because this is a global phenomenon. What art is created, what theatre, or indeed what movies are created out of this period? What have we learned by it? So yes, this dialogue within silence, that it's not a space of nix, it's not a space of nothingness, niente. It's actually a space that is full of a divine conversation, but it's our conversation with, not with our ego, which encourages a monkey chatter in our minds. I notice this, for example, when I'm with Indigenous people, that when they look at you, they have a stillness in their focus, which indicates that there's an extraordinary stillness in the whole of their consciousness as they're processing who you are. And of course, we know that what that focus can often with Indigenous peoples be quite austere or stern or detached, that they're so at one with themselves that as they look out, there's no need to pander to, there's no need to correct, there's no need to perfect, there's no need to even engage unless the engagement is meaningful. I mean, I notice this when I go to Egypt, because we travel for miles through villages to get to certain soul spots that I want to go to lead everybody to, so that we can do rituals, these extraordinary temples that are rather like jewels strung along the spine of the Nile, along the body of the Nile, that are astrogeographical chambers. So as soon as one enters them, one feels the sacred geometry awakening something very profound within one's body, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. However, to travel to these vantage points, we pass thousands and thousands and thousands of people just being on the roadside. Of course, it's Islam, so it's essentially male on the outside and female on the inside. So we don't see a lot of interior inside life, the women and the children living together and doing what women and children do best together. But we do see a lot of men that are, according to our judgment, idle, because they're just sitting there doing nothing. They're talking. There's a lot of cigarette smoking and tea drinking or coffee drinking, but often they just sit and be. And the whole of their intelligence informs one that they're involved in the most extraordinary inner dialogue with the very substance of their nature. There seems to be a tendency to despise the consumerism of the Western world, because they can often be sitting and looking at one another and maybe playing backgammon, maybe not, just looking off into the beingness of the universe. And right next to them is a shit heap of garbage, which nobody's thinking about clearing up. They have a completely different value.
Not paying any attention to.
Not at all. So, a can of Coke or something may be drunk, and then they just do that. Or a plastic bottle with water, they just do that. Nobody thinks of picking it up. It just sits there, because their value system is that they're communing on a totally different level. There seems to be, we despise that, but then when you see the way that they look after the fields, the way that they respect and love Mother Nature, it's absolutely extraordinary. I love engaging with them when they can speak English, because my Arabic is not very good. And they look at one, and they look deep into one's soul. I know what you'll know what I mean, and many of our viewers hopefully will. And so there isn't this miasma that we have in the West of going on. So there's rapid eye movement happening. They just look, and then I engage, and often they speak English. They say, "Where are you from?" They're so curious. Where are you from? And I often play with them and say, "Oh, I'm from Mars." And they look completely confused. But at the same time, they say, "But you nice man." They always go for, they read the quality of who you are. You nice man, you honest man, you true man. Mm-hmm. And often a hand comes out, and a hand goes onto one's heart. And they douse, they read the soul of the person. And so what I'm intrigued by, because particularly over the last 10 or 12 years, the whole country has gone through a cultural revolution where they've moved away from fascism into democracy. So I say, how has it been? And they access how it's been totally, and they'll go right into the story. And often it's to do with the lamentation of the story. And they'll weep and weep and weep and weep, and sometimes weep on my shoulder, because men find it very easy to be physical with one another in the Middle East, which we don't in the West. And then suddenly the tears have gone, and it's inshallah, 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 meaning their hope in God is everything. It's just fascinating that it's a completely different way of being that we have. Mm-hmm. They're not troubled by it all.
Right. I saw a documentary I've searched for, trying to find it for this particular quote so that I could have it exact. It was about urbanization or something, but there was an American Indian man who happened to mention in passing that his people, when the white people first came, called them, and he named a word in his Indian language that meant fire in the mind. That was how they saw white people, was people whose minds were on fire. It was very, they could observe and really see that. And I thought of that as you were talking, and that ability to, in places like where, in situations like you've just shared, one actually feels seen.
Yeah.
And feels also looked at.
Yeah.
Scrutinized and seen. Where often in meeting someone at the grocery store or making a new acquaintance in various ways, one doesn't feel seen in Western societies, in societies such as ours anyway. One doesn't feel seen. One feels the person is seeing themselves relative to this situation. And that creates sort of a barrier to them seeing you, to actually be seeing you. And when it occurs that someone either is in the practice of seeing who they're talking to and hearing who they're speaking to, it can cause moments of feeling startled or self-conscious. Having a practice of seeing and hearing another. Sometimes one needs to give just a little buffer to that, because it can feel invasive. It's not what we really do, is see and really hear and really receive one another. And this is a great impediment to our being, because being is not just like some quiet, private moment. Being is relative to everything and everyone. Only in that relativity to everything is one in being. And so, having separated ourselves from that and distance in how we relate to one another is, a kind of grave thing that we've done, but not a hard thing to remedy. It's really very fun to start seeing one another and to connect with our longing to be seen.
Yeah, now that's a beautiful point, yes. I mean, not that the others have not been, but it sort of brings it into a beautiful crucible of experience, which I completely relate to, the nature of the way that I know that most of my life has been spent wandering around the world, looking into people's eyes, whether they be seemingly meaningful connectivities, such as when I'm plummeted into a relationship where something needs to happen, such as having a conversation with a clerk at a till, at a cash register, or something perhaps more meaningful than that, or walking through a street. I've spent a lot of time being solitary, wandering around the world and noticing the way that people are. And can there be an openness of communication as eyes meet eyes? And then the smile that comes. Most people have expressed to me that they find it daunting to have someone looking into their eyes and smiling, even though they don't know it. So it seems to me that what we're really doing is that we're being our own truth and trying to summon truth in others so that we can have a being of a highly unified, inclusive connection with someone, rather than within the doing frame of reference, where most of the time we're not doing what we could be doing because they say so. In other words, we become engaged in the intellectual competition of quantity rather than experience the quality of what it is to be. And that in bygone civilizations, as I believe with our indigenous peoples, there is a tremendous amount of emphasis placed on, can I trust you? There's that wonderful line that Maya Angelou expressed. When someone tells you their truth, believe them.
That's that is true.
And a lot of people, when I say that, they say, what do you mean? And they somehow miss the irony and the point, because they're so busy being whatever they're being, which is often, I'm not enough, I'm not worthy. How can I possibly be effective in the world? And all of the dramas and traumas that go with it. that we've lost even the ability to be able to perceive truth. And what I love, for example, about my Middle Eastern experience of being in Egypt and looking into these people's eyes, because often there is an energetic transaction taking place, which for them is often to do with baksheesh, baksheesh. They want money because they know that I have more money than they have. I wait to find out who is most true. And if they're not true, I say, you do not have a true soul. And they always become full of antics. And I, no, you don't need to seduce me. I don't need your body. I don't want your body. I'm just looking for your soul. Then they immediately say, oh, here I am. And the mask is start doing that in a reception in Manhattan or London.
Right.
I'm just looking for your soul.
People would back away.
So,
Mm.
and so
Well,
one not to go into those places. I mean, there is that wonderful poem, of course, that was written called "The Invitation" by Orion, the Mountain Dreamer, who's a wonderful Canadian lady who had gone to so many non-present parties where people just weren't being, but were doing all of that stuff that we do in polite society, and then wrote, well, how deeply can we drop into essence and be within the dialogue that lives within silence, which is really, I believe, our conversation with our divine nature, with our absolute quintessential truth, and therefore our conversational dialogue with the divine.
mm-hmm. Which brings us to the deeper levels of being, that conversational dialogue with the divine in us. And that then is what begins to inform our doing. So the idea of, well, we may need to simplify our lives greatly, as some of the stories that we've shared show. What being really is more of a fullness than any one task or necessity about it, because it's from our being that we rise into action, into life, and go back into our being. And there's a rhythm with being of moving in and out of action, always from a place of being, but into action. And so when our being, when the truth of our being begins to inform our action, then we have being expressed. And that's the secret, in a way. That's the key to being in a modern world, to bringing being. It's not to have more time in meditation, more to know the right mantras or chants to say. It's not about those things. It's about to know ourselves, to most deeply know ourselves as the grace, that fills our being is, because that's really the nature of nature. That's the nature of being, is there's this grace. There's that wonderful Wendell Berry poem that people often share. That's when despair grows in me and I wake in the middle of the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be. I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the place of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. I think that's an expression of being that just takes you into being right there.
Thank you so much for the reminder of this beautiful, beautiful poem and the essence that lies glimmering within it.
In that way of wonderful art, it not only like explains it or tells you what something is, it gives you the experience of it. It remembers it into you.
And accesses a very different way of being in the essence of what it is to be, because we can hear within the metaphor, we hear within the language, feeling, essence, feeling. And so I feel we're reminded that feeling is the language of the soul, not clever thinking, but feeling.
Yes.
And this is what poetry gives us, of course.
Yes.
You know, there was a wonderful English poet called Edith Sitwell who said that all poetry is nothing but a suppressed scream. In other words, we go into the rawness of what our nature is all about. Because we're touched very, very deeply by the circumstances of our lives, or by the lack of circumstance within our lives, if something tragic has happened. And the way that we are triggered then encourages into a much more real, more raw, more vital way of being. And then if the words percolate out of us, I mean, the number of times that I've written poems, the best times that I write poems is when I'm weeping immeasurably because a tragedy has taken place in my life. And they have left in some way, whether it be through death or through departure. And I move beyond my ken, pitched past pitch of grief. We all know that, to be pitched past pitch of grief, because grief is the doorway, isn't it? And then we move into a deeper part of what the grieving is all about. We are pitched past pitch.
And in the poem, what he's saying is something so pertinent to now, because so many people feel such grief about now, and deep concern about, like in our country, which way the election will go and what that might mean. But will COVID ever be over? Are we going to be okay? How are we going to be okay? Are we safe? And feel so many concerns. The world is not a safe place. All of the unrest, everything that's wrong with it, there's so much wrong with it. That we start to tell that story, and it becomes the story. But it's not the story, it's just a story. It's not the truth of being. Because, you know, it says here, when there's the despair, when I'm filled with despair, I go where the wood drake in its beauty, you know, is. That would be me and my beauty, where I am my beauty. Rest in the presence of still water, a remembering of this stillness. And then rest in not any concerns about the world, in the grace of the world. And I'm free. Because the world is not this horrible thing and that horrible thing and everything that's so wrong. That's a story that is a road we're going down that I think we must stop. Because the world is not this terrible place where everything's going wrong and human beings do everything bad and wrong and ruin and kill everything. No, that is not it. It is I in my beauty. That is the deeper truth of human beings. That is who I be, I in my beauty. And whether everyone is expressing their beauty is not the point. It is this world has such grace. Let us rest in it, see it, speak of it, story tell of it. Let us make it real to ourselves. That, I think, is the opportunity of silence, of being. If we access all the other stuff, we're just, that's what will be, what is in being, if we access then the other part of ourselves, the beauty, the stillness.
I'm so glad that we recorded what you've just said, because that was quite extraordinary. I'm also very aware of the fact that you are living a life of grace. And so the vital quality of what it is to be, you have arrived at through the many years of your living, and through great success and also through great tragedy. You have always constantly believed in the light beyond the darkness, that grace exists and that all conditions are temporary, as you were saying at the beginning. We have been on this planet for over 200,000 years, and we've experienced many contagions and many wars and many internal societal conflicts. We will get through this. The question is how to get through it. We're suggesting being is a way, and how we can muster the courage to move through by constantly seeing the goodness and the grace in the world, in people, even though they may be making choices that are either conflicting with our own or their behaviors are roughshod. But we're constantly seeking the grace. And the more that we seek the grace, the more we see the grace, because whatever we see on the outside of us is a mirror of what's going on within. And so I suppose this is a partial urge to all those people who may be listening in to seek grace. I'm reminded of the teachings of grace, that the swan is a vessel of grace. In most world cultures, the swan is considered to be a grace-filled being, and that swans never swim in dirty water. If they're in dirty water, then we should fly like a swan to cleaner water. In other words, swans are always seeking grace.
Mm.
We stay in the dirty water. I say get out, meaning what's the point of living in that relationship that is a hate-filled zone? I've just been helping one of my clients through, she's just completed 55 years of marriage. And for 50 of those years, she hated the man that she was married to, and woke up to this 3 years ago, and now is divorcing him.
Wow.
Beginning a new life, you know?
What a point.
And of course, moving towards grace rather than constantly coming home to the ignominy of what that situation was all about, which is, in soul terms, I believe, a huge karmic quest. Yeah, but I mean, that's a revolutionary state of being, isn't it? Because the convention is, particularly of someone of that age who has been in a relationship for 55 and met probably in her early 20s. So that means we're dealing with a very mature person in her latter 70s, early 80s, to suddenly claim freedomhood. Whereas we know that the coda that we were encouraged to live was till death us do part. Stay there, hating him
Right.
for the whole of your life. And what Rosemary was able to do is to say, I don't want that. I want to, before I meet my maker and decide to go back into source, I want to experience the joy that I see the young ones experiencing. And I want to feel the truth, Steward, that you've been talking to me about. I want to feel this rippling through every part of my being. What courage.
Yes, I was thinking that.
What courage.
What courage that decision requires.
Yeah.
Yes, that moving forward. And we all know.
The pleasure body was more exciting than the pain body. The grace is more exciting than the despair.
Right. The grace is there in us all. You know, being brings up that question, who am I? You know, that deep philosophical question that we've even come to think maybe doesn't have an answer. Maybe it's just a philosophical question. But of course, it's a real question. Who am I? And it is the question of life, comes up many times. I was remembering, I just wrote a blog in which I shared this little story from my childhood when there was a man who was very upset with me, and I was little, and he leaned down and very angrily stuck his face near mine and hollered, "Who do you think you are?" about what I had done. And I felt confused and afraid, but also I thought, that's a very good question, and I'm going to think about it when I'm alone. And of course I have many times, and there have been many answers depending. But the deepest answer to who am I is I am that great I am. I am that I am, which is the source of being. I am the source of being. And that's what being means. And that's what, to me, silence really is that being. That is silence. The source of that has a quietude, even in its greatest activity and most active expression. It has a quietude that I am, that I be, as an answer to life's very important ongoing question, who am I?
Yes.
That becoming increasingly intimate with oneself is the process of coming to be.
I feel that that's a beautiful completion to this particular conversation.
And we're probably at our hour.
And we're almost at the hour, yes.
Right, good. Well, it's so wonderful to chat with you.
Thank you. So we will cease trying to figure out what we are, and we will endeavor to feel who we are.
Express more of who we be, who we truly be. And you, dear brother and friend.
And we hope, all of you wonderful people that are tuning in, that you have really relished all of this wonderful exchange of energy that happens between the wonderful Mahulili and myself, and I guess you in relation to me, so vice versa. So it goes in a wonderful figure of eight. So thank you so much for tuning in.